Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to a time of gold, incense, and really spectacular family dysfunction. So, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Just a small, quiet thing. If you like drifting off to strange corners of history, you can leave a like or subscribe. Quietly, of course. It helps the channel, and it tells me you'd like more sleepy stories like this one. But for now, just relax. And let's float gently down the Nile, into the world of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who somehow managed to turn political chaos, sibling murder, and a string of Roman boyfriends into one of history's most enduring bedtime stories. Now, if your idea of Cleopatra is Elizabeth Taylor lounging in eyeliner or a sultry queen lounging on a barge, don't worry, we'll get there. But first, let's exhale, and remember that Cleopatra's life was less a fairy tale, and more a painfully complicated office drama, set in marble palaces with a lot more snakes involved. Because Cleopatra's family, the Ptolemies, were the ancient world's answer to reality television. They had money, power, a complicated family tree that looped in on itself like a knot, and a disturbing enthusiasm for marrying their own siblings. Yes, the Ptolemies took keep it in the family very literally. Let's drift into the setting. Alexandria, around 69 BCE. The city hums with trade, philosophers mumbling in Greek, priests chanting in Egyptian, and bureaucrats sweating through papyrus paperwork. And somewhere in the royal palace, a sprawling complex smelling faintly of lotus oil and paranoia, a baby girl is born. Cleopatra. Now, the thing about being born a Ptolemy was that your bloodline was technically Macedonian Greek. The family descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I, who decided, after Alexander's death, that running Egypt seemed like a fun side project. It was a nice gig, pyramids, fertile land, and an excuse to call yourself pharaoh even if you couldn't read hieroglyphs. But that came with one small problem: the Egyptians didn't really like foreigners ruling them. So, over the next few centuries, the Ptolemies did what any insecure ruling family would do. They tried really hard to seem Egyptian, while speaking Greek at home, worshipping Greek gods, and marrying each other to preserve their pure Macedonian lineage. It was a kind of royal cosplay that got messy. By the time Cleopatra was born, the family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangle of vines strangling itself. Her father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, or the flute player, was not exactly a strong leader. He spent most of his reign performing music, avoiding decisions, and occasionally fleeing the country when things got inconvenient. The nickname wasn't metaphorical, by the way. He genuinely played the flute. Often. Badly. You might think having a musical hobby is charming in a pharaoh. But in ancient Egypt, it mostly made people wonder why their ruler was more interested in reed instruments than taxes. Cleopatra, growing up in this world, learned early that survival meant being clever and quiet. Her education was exceptional. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and several languages. She was the only Ptolemy in living memory who actually bothered to learn Egyptian, a radical move in a dynasty that mostly communicated with its subjects through translators. That alone tells us something: Cleopatra was different. She was calculating, aware, and patient. All traits you needed when your siblings were also your rivals. Let's pause for a moment here. Because Cleopatra's family life deserves its own small, dark corner of the historical imagination. She had a sister named Arsinoe, and two brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. And if you're wondering how many of them she'd later outlive through suspicious circumstances, well, all of them. It's not a spoiler, it's just how the Ptolemies handled HR problems. When their father died, Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII were declared co-rulers. Technically equals. In practice, that meant Cleopatra ruled, and her brother's advisors quietly plotted against her. It's hard to run a kingdom when half the court thinks you should be dead, and the other half is 12 years old. So, Cleopatra did what any practical queen would do. She leaned on diplomacy, flattery, and bribes. But eventually, even her charm couldn't compete with the palace whisper network. By 48 BCE, she found herself exiled, fleeing Alexandria with a few loyal supporters and her ambitions intact. Her brother's faction had won the first round. And this is where the Game of Thrones part really begins. Because into this royal squabble strolls Julius Caesar. Yes, that Caesar. Conqueror of Gaul, part-time dictator, and full-time magnet for trouble. He'd arrived in Egypt chasing his rival Pompey, who'd just been inconveniently murdered by Cleopatra's brother, no less, in an attempt to win Caesar's favor. It did not work. Caesar was furious. Cleopatra saw an opportunity. According to later sources, she smuggled herself into Caesar's quarters rolled up in a carpet, or possibly a linen sack, and presented herself dramatically as the rightful queen. It's a story that sounds too theatrical to be true. But then again, Cleopatra was very good at understanding her audience. And Caesar loved spectacle almost as much as he loved himself. The two quickly became political and personal partners. Cleopatra used his military backing to reclaim her throne. He used her as a convenient symbol of Roman power abroad. Their alliance sparked a small civil war within Alexandria, ending with Ptolemy Xii's death, reportedly drowned in the Nile while trying to flee. Cleopatra was restored as queen, now ruling alongside her other, even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. You can imagine how thrilled he must have been. Somewhere in there, she also gave birth to Caesar's son, named Caesar Ion, because, naturally, modesty was not a family trait. He was Little Caesar, though without the pizza franchise. Now, the thing about Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar is that it wasn't purely romantic. She was too pragmatic for that. Cleopatra understood that charm was a form of statecraft. For her, seduction was diplomacy in silk. She wrapped herself in Egyptian ritual and Greek philosophy, creating an image that was both mystical and modern, the living goddess Isis with a library card. When she visited Rome, she caused a sensation. The Romans adored gossip, and Cleopatra delivered, arriving with her son, living openly in Caesar's villa, and generally behaving as if being the mistress of the world's most powerful man was simply part of her job description. The Senate, meanwhile, was horrified. A foreign queen with divine pretensions? Absolutely scandalous. And yet, Cleopatra didn't care. Because she understood something the Romans didn't: power is a performance. And she was playing her role perfectly. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, stabbed dramatically in the Senate, because Romans had no concept of subtlety, Cleopatra returned to Egypt, now widowed in everything but name. She quickly disposed of her brother Ptolemy XIV, possibly by poisoning him, as one did, and placed her son Caesar Ion on the throne beside her. A mother goddess and her divine child. It was good branding. But peace, as usual, didn't last. Rome descended into yet another civil war, because of course it did, and Cleopatra found herself once again having to pick sides. That's when she met Mark Antony. If Caesar had been her mentor, Antony was her mirror, charming, reckless, and fond of expensive parties. Their first meeting was staged on Cleopatra's royal barge, draped in purple sails and clouds of perfume, while she played the role of the goddess Aphrodite. Subtle, it was not. But Antony, never one to resist a grand gesture, was instantly enchanted. Their partnership was equal parts romance and politics. Cleopatra needed Roman support, Antony needed Egyptian money. Together, they drank, schemed, and produced a small brood of royal children. Meanwhile, back in Rome, people whispered that Antony had gone soft, bewitched by a foreign queen who treated him like a consort instead of a conqueror. The rumors were not entirely wrong. Antony began dressing like an Egyptian, performing rituals with Cleopatra, and generally behaving as though Alexandria were the new Rome. It was a diplomatic scandal wrapped in silk and honey. Eventually, it led to war, the final showdown between Antony and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. We'll drift toward that in a moment, in the next part of our quiet journey. But before we close this chapter of Cleopatra's strange, sleepily tragic story, let's take one last look at her world. The Nile flowing under the moonlight. The scent of incense and lotus. A palace lit by oil lamps, filled with courtiers whispering about whose cup might be poisoned next. And at the center of it all, Cleopatra. Scholar, ruler, survivor. A woman who played the world's most dangerous game, and for a while, won. Let's drift onward, to what came next. To Antony. To defeat. And to a final act written in gold and venom. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, or even half awake, let's drift a little further down the Nile tonight. The lamps are still glowing softly in Alexandria, and Cleopatra is still queen. But somewhere across the sea, in Rome, a young man named Octavian is slowly rearranging the pieces of power, and the endgame is beginning. Now, Mark Antony, Cleopatra's partner, lover, and sometimes liability, was not exactly known for his sense of restraint. He had the build of a soldier, the charm of a tavern poet, and the strategic judgment of someone who thought winging it was a military plan. After Caesar's death, he'd been part of the Second Triumvirate, a kind of Roman group project with Octavian and Lepidus, which worked about as well as most group projects do. And naturally, Antony was assigned the eastern provinces, which included Egypt. It was supposed to be a political arrangement. But then he met Cleopatra again. And that was that. The last time they'd met, it had been all spectacle and seduction. This time, it was business, and then seduction. Cleopatra arrived, as always, in style, a barge draped in purple silk, golden oars dipping rhythmically into the Nile, and servants fanning her like an apparition from some particularly expensive dream. Antony was supposed to summon her to explain her loyalty to Rome. Instead, he fell in love. Or lust. Or perhaps just very expensive fascination. Whatever it was, it quickly turned into a partnership that made history sigh and Rome gossip. Cleopatra provided Antony with wealth, ships, soldiers, and supplies. He, in turn, provided her with something she valued even more, legitimacy. Together, they revived the old Ptolemaic pageantry, presenting themselves as living gods, ruling as the reincarnations of Isis and Dionysus. It was half religion, half theater, and entirely scandalous. Back in Rome, Octavian watched this all unfold with a look best described as judgmental horror. He understood that public image was everything, and Cleopatra made Antony look like a man bewitched by foreign luxury. It didn't help that Antony had left his Roman wife, who, inconveniently, was Octavian's sister. That's the sort of family drama that makes dinner parties awkward for everyone. Still, Cleopatra and Antony seemed unconcerned. They held court in Alexandria, hosting lavish banquets where the wine flowed, the gold shimmered, and the conversation drifted between poetry and geopolitics. At one of these parties, Cleopatra reportedly dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it, just to prove she could. It's the kind of flex that makes you wonder how the servants felt about it. Probably a mix of awe and exhaustion. But beneath the silk and spectacle, things were fraying. Antony's military campaigns in the east faltered, particularly his ill-fated invasion of Parthia, a venture that went about as well as most winter trips across Persia. The failure damaged his reputation, and Octavian pounced. He began a slow, deliberate campaign to paint Antony as a traitor, a man seduced by an Egyptian queen, enslaved by her wealth and her perfumes. Cleopatra, in his version, was a witch, a temptress, the foreign threat to Roman virtue. And the Romans, who were never ones to question a good bit of propaganda, ate it up. Octavian released Antony's will, or claimed to. In it, Antony supposedly left large portions of Roman territory to Cleopatra and her children. It might have been true. It might not. But the effect was devastating. Antony's reputation was ruined, and war became inevitable. The final act began in 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, a naval confrontation off the coast of Greece. Cleopatra and Antony's combined forces faced Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa. It was less a grand romantic showdown and more a logistical disaster at sea. Cleopatra, commanding her own squadron, watched as the battle spiraled into chaos. At one crucial moment, she retreated, perhaps to preserve her ships, perhaps in panic, and Antony followed her, abandoning the fight. Their fleet surrendered soon after. The battle for love had ended in confusion, oars, and sea spray. They fled back to Egypt, where the silence that followed must have been unbearable. Alexandria was still dazzling, still full of wealth and art, but it was also surrounded, politically and soon, literally. Octavian's armies marched south. The Roman world was closing in. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine Cleopatra in her palace, the woman who had once entertained Caesar and Antony, who had outmaneuvered rivals and courtiers alike. Now, the corridors were quieter. The servants whispered. The courtiers had that certain look, the kind that says, "We're updating our resumes." Cleopatra, ever the strategist, tried one last gamble. She attempted to negotiate with Octavian. She offered him treasure, tribute, even her throne, anything to save her children and her dynasty. But Octavian was too careful. He knew the power of spectacle, too. He planned to parade Cleopatra through Rome in chains, the exotic trophy of his victory. That, she decided, would not happen. Meanwhile, Antony was unraveling. He had been a soldier all his life, now he was a man surrounded by defeat. When Octavian's forces finally reached Alexandria, Antony's remaining troops surrendered with minimal resistance. In the confusion, Antony heard that Cleopatra had died, though she hadn't, not yet, and, overwhelmed, he fell on his own sword. It was a messy, desperate act, and even then, he didn't die immediately. He was carried to Cleopatra's chamber, bleeding, and reportedly died in her arms. It was tragic. It was theatrical. It was, in other words, very Roman. Cleopatra knew what came next. She had seen what happened to kings and queens who became Roman trophies. There would be no triumphal parade for her. No cage. No chains. Instead, she dressed in her finest robes, the linen and gold that had once symbolized her divinity, and arranged her final tableau. Two of her attendants, Iris and Charmian, were with her. And then, the famous story, the ASP, the venomous snake smuggled in a basket of figs. It's an image so iconic it's hard to separate from myth. Maybe it happened exactly that way. Maybe it didn't. But when Octavian's men found her, Cleopatra was dead, serene, composed, and unbroken. She was 39. She had reigned for 22 years. Octavian, who would soon rename himself Augustus and quietly invent the Roman Empire, ordered her buried beside Antony. He took Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, and had him executed. Too many Caesars, he reportedly said. Practical. Chilling. Efficient. And so, the long line of pharaohs ended, not with war or fire, but with silence. Egypt became a Roman province. The great library of Alexandria slowly faded into history. The Ptolemaic dynasty, with all its twisted marriages and glittering scandals, was gone. But Cleopatra remained, not as a person, but as an idea. To Romans, she was a cautionary tale about foreign queens. To poets, she was a symbol of tragic love. To historians, she was the last echo of an ancient world that had finally slipped into myth. If you listen closely, though, there's still something oddly comforting about her story. Because underneath the gold and politics, Cleopatra was, in her own quiet, calculating way, human. She wanted power, yes. But she also wanted dignity. And in the end, she claimed it. Let's drift now, just for a moment, through the ruins of her city. Imagine the marble halls half buried under the sand. The mosaics fading in the dark. And above it all, the soft hush of the sea, endless, patient, unbothered. Because history moves on. And sometimes, the only thing left of an empire is the story that puts us gently to sleep. Hey everyone, welcome back. If your eyes are getting a little heavy, that's alright. Tonight, we're not in Alexandria anymore, not really. We're somewhere between memory and myth, in the long twilight of Cleopatra's legacy. Because even though she's been gone for more than 2,000 years, she never really left. Cleopatra didn't just die. She transformed into story, into symbol, into the kind of name that makes history books sound just a little more poetic. So, let's drift softly through time, past the Roman Empire, past the medieval scribes, past the painters and poets, and see what happened to Egypt's last queen after the curtains closed on her mortal life. When Octavian returned to Rome, carrying the spoils of Egypt, he brought with him more than gold and grain. He brought a narrative. In his version of events, Cleopatra had been a dangerous seductress, a foreign enchantress who corrupted a noble Roman man. It was propaganda, of course. Octavian needed Antony's fall to look righteous, and Cleopatra made the perfect villain, exotic, clever, and conveniently dead. It worked beautifully. For the next 2 millennia, much of the Western world would remember Cleopatra through that Roman lens, not as a scholar, not as a ruler, but as a temptress. The ancient historians, mostly men, mostly Roman, couldn't quite wrap their minds around a woman who wielded intellect as well as beauty. So they reduced her to the latter. It was simpler that way. The irony is that the real Cleopatra was probably far less like a femme fatale and far more like a head of state who occasionally had to act like one to survive. She wrote treatises on medicine. She sponsored temple construction. She balanced Egyptian and Greek cultures with surprising delicacy. But in the Roman imagination, she was immortalized as a woman who made powerful men lose their heads, figuratively and literally. As time went on, that version stuck. During the Middle Ages, Europe forgot much of its Greek and Roman knowledge, but the myth of Cleopatra lingered, quietly repackaged into moral tales. She became a cautionary example in sermons, proof that beauty leads to ruin, that women who think too much are dangerous, and that snakes are never to be trusted, metaphorically or otherwise. The poets of the time painted her as both sinner and siren, the perfect story for monks who definitely weren't supposed to be thinking about women at all. By the Renaissance, Cleopatra's image began to shimmer again, this time gilded by art and curiosity. Painters adored her. The death scene, especially, was irresistible, the queen reclining on a couch of gold, her robes slipping dramatically, the asp poised like a tragic punctuation mark. It was part eroticism, part martyrdom, and entirely theatrical. Cleopatra had become the star of her own endless opera. Michelangelo sculpted her. Shakespeare, naturally, gave her some of the best lines in his play Antony and Cleopatra. She was proud, witty, and heartbreakingly aware of her own legend. When she said, "I am fire and air, my other elements I give to baser life," it wasn't just poetic, it was prophecy. She was already dissolving into myth. And then, in the centuries that followed, Cleopatra became whatever the world needed her to be. To the Victorians, she was decadence in human form, the dangerous East and flowing linen. To the early 20th century, she was a femme fatale, a cinematic dream painted in black coal and ivory skin. In Hollywood, she wore eyeliner that could probably be seen from Mars and spoke in the kind of sultry drawl that would have bewildered actual Egyptians. The sets were enormous, the costumes impractical, and the eyeliner budget astronomical. But through all of this, one curious detail remained unchanged. Cleopatra was still fascinating. Even when misrepresented, even when simplified, she refused to fade. Because unlike many ancient rulers, she had personality, or at least, the memory of one vivid enough to survive 2,000 years of retelling. Let's pause here. Think about that for a moment. Most of the world's ancient monarchs are little more than names in stone. We know their dates, their wars, their tombs, but not their voices. Cleopatra, though, feels alive. She laughs. She argues. She schemes. She loves. Even her death feels deliberate, like one last act of authorship. It's strange, and maybe a little comforting, to realize that she achieved in death what so many rulers never could in life: permanence. Now, let's drift a little deeper, into the quieter corners of her reputation, the forgotten parts. Modern archaeology has done its best to separate the legend from the woman. Coins bearing her image, for instance, show a queen who wasn't the dazzling beauty of legend. Her features were strong, her nose prominent, her expression deliberate. She looked like someone who read reports, made hard decisions, and didn't have much time for nonsense. In other words, she looked like a ruler. And perhaps that's the most interesting thing about Cleopatra, that her allure wasn't purely physical, but intellectual. She spoke as many as 9 languages. She debated philosophy with visiting scholars. She negotiated with generals. She probably smelled faintly of myrrh and strategy. The problem, of course, is that men throughout history found that combination deeply unsettling. And so, they rewrote her. Not as the queen who kept Egypt independent for 2 decades, but as the woman who made men fall apart. Even now, her intelligence is sometimes treated like a footnote to her beauty, as though the two cannot coexist. But in truth, Cleopatra's story is one of balance. She was a ruler in an impossible position, a Greek queen on Egyptian soil, surrounded by Romans who would have preferred her quietly married off or conveniently dead. And yet, she ruled anyway. She played the game better than anyone else could. Until the game itself changed. When Octavian became Augustus, Egypt became Rome's private garden, the emperor's personal possession. The grain of the Nile fed the empire, and for centuries after, the land that once belonged to Cleopatra became a place of quiet obedience. But the memory of her lingered, like perfume on the air. Even the Romans couldn't quite let her go. They built statues of her likeness, sometimes without realizing it, the lines between goddess, queen, and myth blurring until nobody could say where history ended and imagination began. And perhaps that's fitting. Because Cleopatra's story was never meant to end neatly. She was always half in shadow, half a woman, half an idea. A mortal queen who made herself divine, and in doing so, became eternal. Let's drift now to the present, where her name still sells books, perfumes, and movies. Where every few years, another actress steps into her sandals and tries to capture that same impossible combination of intellect, danger, and grace. Each generation recreates her in its own image, and maybe that's the truest sign of her immortality. To the Romans, she was the threat of foreign power. To the Victorians, she was forbidden desire. To the modern world, she's the symbol of female ambition, the woman who dared to rule, to love, and to die on her own terms. And maybe that's why her story still whispers to us, softly, in the dark. Because Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was a reminder that beauty fades, that empires crumble, but that the stories we tell about ourselves can outlast marble, metal, and time itself. So as we drift toward the end of this long, quiet journey, picture the Nile one last time. The moonlight tracing silver paths over the water. The hum of insects. The faint scent of lilies and dust. And somewhere, deep beneath the sand and stone, the echo of a woman's laughter, calm, certain, and utterly unafraid. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. The first icon. The eternal ruler of Egypt. Good night. And sleep well. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you're officially more patient than most Roman senators. Tonight, we're drifting beyond Cleopatra's death, into the quieter, slower afterlife of her world. Because while her story ends dramatically, snakes, silk, and sorrow, Egypt itself didn't just vanish with her. It lived on. Changed, subdued, and strangely peaceful, like a once mighty orchestra playing its final notes in minor key. Let's take a slow breath, and step into Egypt after Cleopatra. When Octavian, soon to be Augustus, claimed victory, he didn't just win a war. He inherited an entire civilization. Egypt became his personal property, not a province governed by the Senate, but the emperor's own domain. It was, quite literally, his private estate. And that tells you everything about how the Romans viewed it: too rich, too strategic, too essential to trust anyone else with. Grain from the Nile fed half the empire. The harvests were predictable, the taxes enormous, and the people, on the whole, quietly resigned to their new Roman landlords. The priests still chanted in the temples, the farmers still tilled the fields, but the pulse of power had shifted, from Alexandria to Rome, from pharaoh to emperor. Egypt was no longer a kingdom of gods. It was a ledger entry. Still, Augustus understood the value of appearances. He didn't destroy Egyptian religion or impose Roman gods by force. Instead, he let the two cultures mingle, softly, like layers of silt settling after a flood. Temples to Isis and Serapis remained open. Roman soldiers began offering sacrifices beside Egyptian priests. Even Cleopatra's face, her memory, wasn't erased entirely, just adjusted. She became another story Rome could tell itself. There's something oddly poetic about that. The woman who fought to preserve Egypt's independence ended up making it interesting enough for the Romans to preserve instead of demolish. It was assimilation by admiration. A quiet surrender that looked almost like respect. Alexandria, once a royal capital, became an imperial port. The philosophers stayed. The scholars stayed. The traders, of course, never left. Money tends to ignore politics. The Great Library may or may not have already burned. Historians still argue about that, usually late at night when they should be sleeping, but the city's intellectual pulse endured. It became a kind of Roman Alexandria, still cosmopolitan, still humming with languages, but now under the careful watch of the emperor's prefect. That prefect had one major rule: no senators allowed. Augustus didn't trust the Senate with Egypt. He remembered what had happened with Antony, a Roman governor falling under Egyptian influence, seduced by its wealth and charm. He wasn't about to let that happen again. So only equestrians, members of the lower Roman elite, could serve there. Egypt became a gilded cage of bureaucracy, its borders sealed tighter than the pharaoh's tombs. But even under Roman rule, something of Cleopatra's world lingered, especially in religion. You see, Egyptian gods were adaptable. They didn't die when their temples did. They simply changed names. Isis, the mother goddess Cleopatra had once embodied, became one of the most beloved deities of the Roman world. Her temples appeared from Spain to Syria. Romans worshipped her as the bringer of fertility, healing, and love, never realizing they were keeping a piece of Egypt alive in their marble cities. In some ways, Isis replaced Cleopatra as Egypt's immortal queen. Meanwhile, Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son, was gone, executed by Octavian's order. But her other children, the ones she'd had with Antony, were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and, awkwardly, Cleopatra's former rival. It's one of those quiet historical ironies that feels almost too delicate to be real. The children of Rome's greatest scandal raised in the household of the woman their father had betrayed. And yet, Octavia treated them kindly. History doesn't record their fates in much detail. They faded quietly into Rome's enormous shadow, forgotten like the last echoes of a distant song. Let's drift now through the centuries that followed. Egypt became one of the empire's most stable provinces, and one of its most exploited. Its people were taxed heavily, its grain shipped north, its treasures catalogued and displayed in Roman villas. But life, as it tends to, went on. Markets bustled. Temples glittered. And the Nile, steady, eternal, kept flowing, as if unaware that history had changed around it. Over time, Egypt's old gods began to mingle with new ones. Greco-Roman hybrids flourished. The Sphinx was repaired under Emperor Hadrian. Temples to Serapis, a fusion of Greek Zeus and Egyptian Osiris, became fashionable. For a while, Alexandria even hosted a famous philosopher named Hypatia, a woman scholar who, centuries later, would meet her own tragic end at the hands of zealots. It's strange how often history repeats its cruelties. But slowly, inevitably, the light dimmed. Rome itself began to crack. Trade faltered. Plagues spread. The empire fractured, then split in two. And as Christianity rose, the old Egyptian gods fell silent. The temples were shuttered. Priests turned into scribes. The language of the pharaohs, hieroglyphs, was forgotten. For more than 1,000 years, no one could read the walls of their ancestors. The very words of Cleopatra's world turned to silence. And yet, her story survived. Through Roman texts, through whispers, through the faint lines of poetry that refused to die. Even when Egypt became Byzantine, and then Arab, and then Ottoman, her legend remained tucked inside the sand. Waiting. Then came the 19th century. The age of discovery, or, more accurately, rediscovery. European explorers arrived, armed with shovels, notebooks, and an extraordinary sense of entitlement. They dug through tombs, carted off obelisks, and proudly called it archaeology. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, bringing with him not only soldiers but scholars, artists, and scientists. And among their discoveries was the Rosetta Stone, a single artifact that would, eventually, unlock the lost language of Egypt. When hieroglyphs were finally deciphered by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s, a door opened. The ancient voices could speak again. The gods, the kings, even the tax receipts, all readable at last. And somewhere, in that vast chorus of rediscovered history, Cleopatra's voice re-emerged. She was no longer just the temptress of Roman rumor. She became visible again, the scholar, the strategist, the polyglot queen. Archaeologists searched for her tomb, endlessly, and still do. It's never been found. Somewhere near the ancient temple of Taposiris Magna, perhaps, she waits. A queen without a resting place, or perhaps one too clever to be found. Let's pause there. It's a fitting image, isn't it? Cleopatra, even in death, refusing to be neatly categorized or claimed. The Romans took her empire, but not her story. They rewrote her, but couldn't erase her. She outlasted them all. And maybe that's the quiet triumph of her legend. Not the gold, not the power, but the endurance. Her name still spoken, her face still imagined, her story still retold, even now, in the soft hum of a midnight history video, 2,000 years later. Let's drift, just a little further, into Egypt's long twilight under Rome. The emperors came and went. Some visited the Nile out of curiosity. Hadrian traveled there with his young companion Antinous, who famously drowned in the river and was deified, in a strange echo of the old Egyptian rites. Others treated Egypt as a backdrop for grand tours, a picturesque ruin, full of pyramids and melancholy. By the time Christianity had taken hold, Cleopatra's world was unrecognizable. The temples of Isis became churches. The hieroglyphs, sacred for 3,000 years, were now dismissed as pagan nonsense. The Library of Alexandria, whatever remained of it, faded entirely into memory. But the Nile flowed on, as it always does, quietly ignoring the concerns of gods and empires alike. And through it all, Cleopatra's ghost lingered. Sometimes as a symbol of lost grandeur. Sometimes as a warning. Sometimes as a dream. Because every empire needs its ghosts, reminders of what power costs, and what beauty can't save. Rome became Byzantium, Byzantium became dust, and still the world whispered her name. Cleopatra. The queen who became a myth. The myth who became an idea. And the idea that refuses to die. So, as we end this long, sleepy voyage down the centuries, let's take one last look over the quiet river of time. The moon is low now. The water glows faintly silver. And somewhere, under the sand in the ruins, a queen sleeps, or maybe just waits, her story still unending. Because in the end, Egypt didn't vanish. It changed. And in its endless cycle of rebirth, empire to empire, ruin to wonder, Cleopatra remains its final whisper. Not the villain Rome painted. Not the siren of Hollywood. But the last breath of an ancient world that refused to go quietly. So if you're still awake, take a slow breath. And remember her not as the doomed queen of a fading kingdom, but as the woman who turned survival into an art form, and her own death into immortality. Good night. And may your dreams be full of moonlight and marble, of river reeds and gold, and of a queen who knew exactly how to make history remember her. When we last left her, Cleopatra had faded into legend, her kingdom absorbed by Rome, her tomb lost to time, her memory preserved only in fragments. But, as with all truly magnetic figures, absence became a kind of power. And over the next 2,000 years, Cleopatra would be reborn again and again, in marble, in paint, on stage, on screen, reshaped by every era that dreamed of her. Tonight, we're wandering through that long afterlife, through the centuries of imagination that turned a historical queen into a mythic mirror of beauty, ambition, and ruin. So, close your eyes, and picture a candle flickering in a Renaissance study. A scholar, pale, ink-stained, and possibly half insane, is hunched over a manuscript of Plutarch, rediscovering the ancient world. The printing press has just made old stories new again, and among them, Cleopatra's tale gleams like buried gold. To the Renaissance mind, she was a paradox. A woman who combined intellect with sensuality, courage with tragedy. They painted her not as a villain, but as a philosopher queen, her death scene rendered with tender precision. You can almost see it, the pearls, the ASP, the bare shoulder, the faint smile. In those paintings, death looks less like punishment and more like choice. And that's how Europe wanted to see her, not as a warning, but as a symbol of agency in a world ruled by men. But history never sits still. By the Baroque era, Cleopatra became more theatrical. Painters like Guido Reni and Artemisia Gentileschi gave her drama, decadence, and drama again, silk spilling, serpents gleaming, her body framed in luxurious ruin. Every brushstroke whispered, "This is what power looks like when it dares to be feminine." In some ways, that's been her eternal paradox. Every age remakes her to reflect what it fears or desires most about women. To the Romans, she was danger incarnate. To the Renaissance, she was mystery and intellect. To the Victorians, well, she was temptation. The 19th century loved to dress Cleopatra up in Orientalist fantasy, gold, coal, and danger. Painters like Jerome and Alma-Tadema imagined her lounging on alabaster couches, surrounded by servants, her gaze lazy and lethal. It wasn't history. It was escapism. The Egypt they painted was exotic, erotic, and entirely imaginary, a backdrop for Western fantasies about the mystical East. But beneath all that exoticism, there was a quiet obsession. What if Cleopatra wasn't just a seductress? What if she was smarter than all the men who tried to write her story? That question simmered for centuries. It would take the 20th century to start answering it. Clapperboard the silver screen queen. Cleopatra arrived in Hollywood early. Silent film actresses like Theda Bara and Claudette Colbert draped themselves in cobras and gold leaf long before Elizabeth Taylor ever set foot in Egypt. Theda Bara's 1917 version, long since lost to time, was pure spectacle, scandalous even then. Colbert's 1934 film, directed by Cecil B. DeMille, gave her wit and charisma, a queen who could banter as well as seduce. But it was Elizabeth Taylor's 1963 Cleopatra that would burn her image into modern memory. You've seen it, the eyeliner that launched 1,000 Halloween costumes. The procession into Rome with 100 white horses. Taylor's gaze, equal parts steel and softness, as she declares herself Isis Reborn. The production nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox. It was chaotic, cursed, and dazzling, like Cleopatra herself. But for all its excess, it did something extraordinary. It made people care about her again. Not as a relic, but as a living, breathing woman, ambitious, clever, flawed, and unforgettable. Taylor's Cleopatra wasn't just a queen, she was a statement. In a world where female power was still seen as dangerous, she made it glorious. Performing arts the modern queen. After Hollywood came reinterpretation. Scholars began peeling away centuries of propaganda, asking who Cleopatra really was beneath all that myth. Archaeology revealed a queen who spoke 9 languages, who wrote policy documents in Greek and Egyptian, who navigated one of the most dangerous political environments in history with precision. Coins bearing her face showed not a beauty idealized by poets, but a shrewd ruler, strong nose, firm jaw, intelligent eyes. Her features spoke of mixed ancestry, of Greek lineage and Egyptian identity, a bridge between worlds. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Cleopatra had become more than just a historical curiosity. She was an icon of identity, a question mark in the narrative of empire. Was she Greek? Egyptian? African? Mediterranean? Every new generation claimed her, sometimes politically, sometimes personally. And maybe that's the point. Cleopatra was never one thing. She was both. Both ruler and romantic, foreigner and native, divine and mortal. And that multiplicity is why she endures. Artists today still paint her. Authors still reinvent her. Films and series, from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to Netflix's modern retellings, keep her alive, reshaping her in the image of each new era's imagination. Some see her as the last pharaoh. Some as the first modern woman. Some as a symbol of resistance, a queen who dared to play Rome's game and nearly won. And still, the question remains. Was she ever really defeated? Amphora the queen's ghost. Let's drift, one last time, back to the Nile. It's night again, as it always seems to be when we talk about her. The water glows under a half-moon, and the papyrus reeds whisper secrets. Somewhere, perhaps near Taposiris Magna, archaeologists keep digging. Every few years, a new headline, Cleopatra's tomb may have been found. But it never is. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe she doesn't want to be found. Because in a way, she already lives everywhere, in every painting, every poem, every film that dares to imagine her. The real Cleopatra might be gone, but her ghost still walks through our collective imagination. She's not bound to a tomb, she's bound to us. That's the power of story. Empires fall, languages die, monuments crumble, but a story can survive it all. And hers has. Crescent Moon, the final reflection. So what does Cleopatra mean now, in the quiet modern world of screens and whispers and midnight YouTube rabbit holes? Maybe she's a reminder that history isn't fixed. That even the most famous people in the world can be rewritten, reinterpreted, rediscovered. That no empire, no narrative, no propaganda lasts forever. The Romans tried to destroy her legacy, and yet, here we are. Talking about her, listening to her echoes, letting her linger in our dreams. Perhaps that's the greatest revenge of all. To be remembered not as they said you were, but as you choose to be. Cleopatra chose how her story would end. With a crown, a serpent, and silence. And in that silence, she became immortal. So, let's end where we began. The candles are low, the Nile is calm, and the world outside your window has gone still. You can almost hear the lapping of water against stone, the distant cry of an ibis, the faint rustle of papyrus. And somewhere, not in a tomb, but in memory, Cleopatra is smiling. Because she knows that after 2,000 years, we're still talking about her. And in the end, that's all a queen ever really wants. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, that's fine, though at this point, even Cleopatra herself might have dozed off. Tonight, we're floating through the centuries after her death, through the Egypt that survived without her. Because while the queen was gone, the land remained. The Nile still flooded. The harvest still came. But something had shifted, quietly, permanently. Egypt, for the first time in 3,000 years, no longer belonged to Egyptians. When Octavian, soon to be Augustus, claimed Egypt in 30 BC, he didn't just take a province. He took a trophy. Cleopatra's kingdom became his personal possession, like a collector acquiring a masterpiece that had been slightly inconveniently alive. Egypt would no longer have kings or queens. Instead, it would have prefects, Roman governors appointed directly by the emperor. Senators weren't even allowed to visit without permission. The land that had once ruled the known world was now a tightly controlled, private estate of Rome. The irony, of course, is that Egypt remained utterly essential. Its grain fed the city of Rome, literally kept the empire alive. Ships left Alexandria loaded with wheat, figs, papyrus, and the faint smell of resentment. If the Nile failed, Romans went hungry. So Augustus treated the river like a god and the people like loyal servants. He even built temples in the Egyptian style, pretending to honor their gods while quietly erasing their meaning. A very Roman sort of courtesy. And yet, the Egyptians, pragmatic as always, adapted. They had seen conquerors come and go for centuries, Hyksos, Persians, Greeks. Rome was just another chapter in the long list of people claiming divine right to taxes. But what changed was the soul of Egypt. The pharaohs had always been gods, the living link between the heavens and the Nile. Now, the emperor in distant Rome claimed that role. A foreigner, seated on a marble throne thousands of miles away, was called Son of Ra. It must have felt strange, almost absurd. And yet, temples kept functioning. Priests still performed the old rituals. Because Egyptians understood something the Romans didn't. That power fades, but ceremony endures. Still, one by one, the gods began to dim. By the 2nd century AD, the temples of Isis and Osiris had fallen quiet. The language of the hieroglyphs, once sacred, eternal, slipped into obscurity. And then, as if gently exhaling, Egypt's old religion disappeared. When Christianity took root in the 4th century, it spread quickly through Egypt's villages and ports. The cross replaced the ink. Saints replaced the gods. And the old temples were dismantled or repurposed, their stones recarved, their stories rewritten. It's easy, from a distance, to call it progress. But imagine living through it, the slow fading of everything familiar. The loss not through conquest, but through forgetting. By the time the Library of Alexandria was finally gone, burned, scattered, or simply neglected, Egypt had become something else entirely. Still beautiful. Still vital. But no longer the Egypt Cleopatra knew. Let's drift now through that new landscape. Alexandria remained one of the great cities of the ancient world, bustling, cosmopolitan, and occasionally riotous. Its lighthouse, one of the seven wonders, still stood over the harbor, flashing its beacon across the sea. But now, it was watched not by scholars and philosophers, but by soldiers. The scholars who once debated geometry in the museum had mostly gone quiet. Their scrolls turned to dust. And in their place came bishops, monks, and translators, rewriting the world in Latin and Coptic. Still, Cleopatra lingered. Her story whispered through the ruins like a rumor that refused to die. Roman poets still mentioned her, cautiously, often mockingly, but never forgetting. She became a kind of phantom lesson. What happens when power wears a woman's face? Augustus had her statues removed, her name erased from official records. But in private, in art and whispers, she endured. In mosaics, she appeared as Venus, the goddess of love, ironic, since Augustus claimed Venus as his own ancestor. It was as though even the empire that tried to erase her couldn't help but reincarnate her. Time rolled forward, calmly, inevitably. The Roman Empire fractured. New rulers came, then fell. By the 7th century, the Arab conquest brought Islam to Egypt, another layer, another language, another rhythm to the Nile. The ancient gods were long gone by then. But their faces still watched from temple walls, half erased, half smiling. It's funny, isn't it? Cleopatra's world was built on the idea of permanence, marble, monuments, dynasties. But the only thing that lasted was her story. The temples crumbled. The tombs were looted. Even her own burial place, the last queen of Egypt, vanished. Yet her name survived everything. There's a strange kind of poetry in that. Sometimes the most enduring monuments are not made of stone, but of words. A whisper that crosses centuries. A name that glows faintly even when everything else is dark. Cleopatra, once flesh and voice and scent, now just vibration and memory. But still powerful enough to outlive the empires that buried her. Let's pause here, just for a moment. Listen, really listen, to the sound of that name in your mind. The syllables slide like water, Cleopatra. It feels ancient, but somehow alive. Maybe that's why the world keeps coming back to her, to retell, to repaint, to reimagine. Because her story is not just about power or beauty. It's about impermanence. About the way even queens fade, yet their stories refuse to. And maybe, just maybe, that's the quiet victory she planned all along. So, as the last lights of Alexandria dim in our imagination, and the Nile drifts calmly under the stars, let's end not with the fall of Egypt, but with the echo of a voice that once said, "I will not be triumphed over." And she never was. Not really. Because she's still here, in your mind, in this quiet night. And in the long, sleepless hum of history that refuses to forget. Good night. And sleep well, traveler. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still with me, that's impressive. You've made it through the fall of dynasties, the fading of gods, and the long quiet centuries when even the Nile seemed to forget her name. Tonight, we're wandering through time again, forward now, into the age of rediscovery. The world has changed. The pyramids are ancient curiosities, half buried in sand. Europe is in its age of exploration, and Egypt is about to become a dream that scholars and artists can't stop chasing. But before the tourists came, before the souvenir sellers and the postcard sunsets, there was only silence. For more than 1,000 years, the hieroglyphs had gone unread. Egypt's language was lost, its monuments mute. And then, in 1799, a French soldier digging a trench near the town of Rosetta found a black stone, smooth, inscribed in 3 languages: Greek, Demonic, and the mysterious hieroglyphs. The Rosetta Stone. It's a quiet object, really, just a broken slab of basalt. But it was the key that unlocked an entire civilization. When Jean-François Champollion deciphered it in 1822, the dead voices of Egypt began to speak again. Temples could finally tell their stories. Tombs could whisper names that had been silent for 2 millennia. And among those names, Cleopatra returned. Her name appeared in cartouches, those ovals that framed royal names and hieroglyphs. It was there, carved beside gods and kings. And for the first time in centuries, scholars could actually read it. Cleopatra. The sound of it must have felt electric, like a ghost breathing again. In the 19th century, Europe fell in love with ancient Egypt all over again. It wasn't love, exactly, more like obsession. They called it Egyptomania. Everywhere you looked, Egypt appeared. In furniture, wallpaper, opera houses, and perfume ads. London salons filled with obelisks and scarabs. Paris cafes named themselves Le Sphinx. And in the midst of this gilded fascination, Cleopatra re-emerged, the perfect muse for a world enchanted by antiquity. But, of course, she came back their way, romanticized, painted, and mythologized all over again. Painters like Jean-Léon Gérôme and Lawrence Alma-Tadema filled canvases with visions of Cleopatra that had more silk than accuracy. They painted her reclining on golden couches, surrounded by incense and servants, a shimmering fantasy of ancient luxury. To them, she wasn't a stateswoman or linguist, she was beauty and danger wrapped in gold leaf. Still, these images kept her alive. They made her visible again. And while Europe's empires were expanding across Africa and Asia, Cleopatra became an icon of the mystical East, exotic, unknowable, desirable. A projection, not a person. It's a little ironic, isn't it? That even after being conquered by Rome, she was once again conquered by imagination. Let's drift gently now into the 20th century, the century that turned her from myth into movie. The camera loved Cleopatra almost as much as poets did. In 1917, Theda Bara played her in a silent film that scandalized censors and delighted audiences. The film is mostly lost now, but the surviving stills tell the story: Cleopatra draped in serpentine jewelry, smoky eyes, and expressions that could curdle wine. Then came Claudette Colbert in 1934, witty, flirtatious, and impossibly elegant. Her Cleopatra was modern, sharp, and self-aware, less tragic queen, more businesswoman who occasionally wore gold armor. But it was in 1963 that Cleopatra reached her cinematic apotheosis. Elizabeth Taylor. The film that nearly destroyed a studio, and accidentally cemented her myth for another century. Taylor's Cleopatra was a force of nature, intelligent, seductive, manipulative, and strangely fragile. Every frame dripped with excess: marble halls, ivory ships, entire armies of extras who probably wished they were somewhere else. The production was chaotic, millions over budget, years in the making, but somehow perfect. Because that's what Cleopatra always was: chaos turned beautiful. The film wasn't accurate. But accuracy wasn't the point. It was spectacle, a modern temple built to an ancient name. Meanwhile, in the real world, archaeologists kept searching. Not for her image, but for her remains. Some believed she was buried near Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria. Others thought her tomb lay beneath the modern city, lost forever under concrete and sea. Excavations continue even now. And each time, headlines whisper, Cleopatra's tomb found? But it never quite is. Maybe that's part of her magic. Cleopatra's resting place has become the world's favorite secret. The queen who once made herself a goddess seems determined to remain one. It's easy to imagine her laughing somewhere, quietly, elegantly, at all the archaeologists still chasing her across the centuries. Let's drift a little higher now, above the sand, above the ruins, above the blue curve of the Nile. From here, Egypt stretches endless under the sun, a quilt of fields and water and gold. Somewhere beneath it all lies the queen who refused to fade. And in the distance, the modern world hums, cities glowing, cars moving, people living their small, bright lives. And still, the old stories whisper. Cleopatra's face appears on magazine covers, her name in songs, her legend in classrooms and late-night documentaries. She's history's favorite paradox, the queen who lost everything and became immortal for it. Even now, her story is retold every few years. New films, new theories, new arguments over her ancestry, her beauty, her brilliance. It's as if the world keeps trying to answer a question she never really asked. Who was Cleopatra, really? Maybe the answer is that she was who she chose to be. Every version of her, from Plutarch's schemer to Shakespeare's siren, from Taylor's goddess to modern scholarship's strategist, says more about us than her. Cleopatra is the mirror we hold up to our fantasies about power, gender, and control. We see what we want to see, and she, as always, lets us. That's her final victory. 2,000 years after her death, she still controls her image. She's still the storyteller, not the subject. And so, as the night fades and the story ends, picture her one last time. On a quiet terrace above the Nile, gold catching the last light, a scroll in one hand and a knowing half-smile. The empire has fallen. The lovers are gone. But the legend, her legend, is eternal. Because even in ruins, some names never stop shining. Good night, wanderer. You've drifted through centuries tonight, through sand and marble and myth. And somewhere in all that, perhaps you've met her, not as the Romans painted her, but as she wanted to be remembered. Clever, beautiful, flawed, and free. Sleep well. And if you dream, may it be of moonlight on the Nile, and the sound of her laughter just beyond the water. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're not heading to Egypt. We're drifting into Europe, into candlelit palaces and chilly mountain castles where portraits stare down with suspiciously similar faces. If you've ever looked at old royal paintings and thought, they all sort of look the same, well, you're not wrong. And no dynasty proved that quite like the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs ruled much of Europe for centuries: Austria, Spain, Bohemia, Hungary, the Netherlands. They collected titles the way other people collect regrets. And with every generation, they found creative new ways to marry themselves. It wasn't just about love, rarely was. It was about blood. Royal blood. Which, ironically, was exactly what they kept diluting by trying to preserve. Let's start with Charles II of Spain, the most famous product of that unfortunate strategy. Born in 1661, Charles was, in every possible way, the result of too much enthusiasm for family reunions. His family tree wasn't so much a tree as it was a wreath. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents, also cousins. By the time Charles arrived, the genetic pool had become a puddle. He was frail from birth. Couldn't walk properly until nearly 4. Couldn't speak clearly until almost 8. And he had a jaw so pronounced it could have been its own small kingdom. That famous Habsburg jaw wasn't a metaphor, it was a full architectural feature. He struggled to chew, so his diet consisted mostly of soft foods. and his speech was nearly impossible to understand. But somehow, he ruled Spain, or rather, Spain ruled itself around him, for 35 long, uneasy years. The courtiers called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Because obviously, when your king is visibly falling apart, witchcraft seems like the logical explanation. Doctors tried everything. Exorcisms, prayers, bloodletting, the usual 17th century wellness routine. None of it helped. By the time he died at 38, Spain's empire was collapsing under debt, disease, and dynastic confusion. He left no heirs, because of course he didn't. His body was reportedly small, his organs underdeveloped, and his jaw, according to the autopsy, unable to close properly. That's one way to describe an entire century of genetic optimism gone wrong. When he died, the Spanish crown passed to the Bourbons, and the Habsburg line in Spain finally, mercifully, ended. Europe let out a collective sigh of genetic relief. But Charles wasn't alone. His ancestors had been quietly preparing him for this finale for generations. Take Philip II, his great-grandfather, the one who married Mary Tudor of England, a woman known for burning Protestants and never smiling. He was so controlled, so fanatically devout, that even his portraits look like they're holding their breath. Or Emperor Maximilian II, who married his own first cousin, and then encouraged all his children to marry their cousins, too, because apparently, no one had learned statistics yet. They believed keeping pure blood preserved divine right. What it really preserved were jaw disorders, infertility, and a striking family resemblance that stretched across continents. It's both tragic and a little darkly funny. They ruled half the world, but couldn't master basic genetics. Even outside Spain, the Habsburg name was everywhere. They intermarried so thoroughly that, at one point, most of Europe's monarchs could trace their lineage back to the same handful of ancestors. If you've ever heard the phrase "let others wage war, you, lucky Austria, marry," that was the Habsburg family motto. They didn't win wars. They married them. And for centuries, it worked. Until, of course, it didn't. Because what began as a clever political strategy eventually became a genetic slow-motion car crash. The result was a dynasty of fragile bodies, melancholy minds, and portraits that all look like the same man slowly realizing what's gone wrong. But perhaps the strangest thing? For all their flaws, the Habsburgs weren't villains. They were simply convinced, as many royals were, that they were chosen. Chosen by God. Chosen by blood. And when you believe that, it's easy to see why marrying outside the family would seem almost irreligious. They truly thought they were preserving something sacred. They just didn't realize that divinity doesn't mix well with chromosomes. So tonight, as we close our eyes and imagine the candlelight flickering in those echoing palaces, picture the long line of pale faces staring out from oil paintings, same chin, same expression, same faint melancholy. It's haunting, really. A dynasty undone not by war or rebellion, but by its own reflection. Sleep softly, my friend. And remember, if you ever feel your family is complicated, at least you can close your jaw. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're heading to 18th century Britain. A time when wigs were tall, trousers were tight, and the royal family had no idea how to behave in public, or, honestly, in private either. You see, the Georgian kings of England were not a graceful bunch. They were complicated, stubborn, and frequently at odds with reality, and with each other. It's like watching a family drama written by someone who thinks emotional repression is a plot twist. Let's start where the story begins, with George I, the reluctant king who didn't speak English. When Queen Anne died in 1714, childless, gout-ridden, and exhausted, Britain needed a Protestant monarch. The next in line just happened to be a German prince, Elector George Ludwig of Hanover. He was 54, grumpy, and about as English as sauerkraut. He became George I, King of Great Britain, which was awkward, because he barely understood the language, the customs, or the people. He brought with him a household full of German courtiers who couldn't be bothered to pretend they liked London. To the English, their new king seemed cold and dull. To George, England was just damp and loud. But his domestic life made politics look easy. He'd married his cousin, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, and it went about as well as you'd expect. She fell in love with another man. He found out. The lover was murdered under mysterious circumstances, as in, found dead in a river with stab wounds mysterious. George divorced her and locked her away in a castle for the rest of her life. Every few years, he'd send her a note. Never an apology. Just a reminder that she was still under guard. Romantic, really. He died in 1727, en route to visit his beloved Hanover. Some say his last words were spoken in German, others say he just sighed. Either way, England shrugged and crowned his son. George II was fine. He had one foot in England, one in Germany, and both in a perpetual argument with his father, even after his father's death. He was the last British king to personally lead troops into battle, at Dettingen in 1743. Which sounds heroic until you realize he mostly yelled in German at soldiers who didn't understand him. At home, he argued constantly with his wife, Caroline, and their children. Particularly with his son, Frederick, whom he once banned from the palace entirely. Frederick responded by mocking his father in pamphlets and running his own rival court. Dinner must have been awkward. George II outlived most of his enemies, and when he finally died, they found him on the floor beside his bed, apparently mid-breakfast. Heart aneurysm. Instant, quiet, and thoroughly efficient. Very German of him. Now, George III, that's where things start to wobble. When he came to the throne in 1760, he was only 22, polite, and determined to be a good king. And, for a while, he was. He loved his wife, Queen Charlotte, with actual affection, a rare thing in royal marriages. They had 15 children. Yes, 15. Because, apparently, that was his hobby. George was earnest, hard-working, and slightly dull, a man who would rather discuss farming techniques than politics. He read constantly, collected clocks, and tried to live simply. Unfortunately, his reign was anything but simple. First came the loss of the American colonies. Which, in fairness, wasn't entirely his fault. Parliament did most of the work, but history loves a scapegoat. So, in American schoolbooks, he became the tyrant king. The truth? He was more confused than cruel. But then, around 1788, something began to change. George started talking incessantly. He'd stay up for days, rambling about divine messages, writing pages of nonsense, and insisting he was perfectly fine. His speech sped up, his thoughts raced, and courtiers whispered that the king had gone mad. Today, historians suspect porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause neurological symptoms. At the time, it was called melancholy madness. His doctors tried everything: bleeding, purging, ice baths, even moral therapy. Nothing worked. In his lucid moments, George wept. He knew what was happening. And that, somehow, made it sadder. They eventually confined him to Windsor Castle, where he wandered the halls blind, murmuring prayers and fragments of old speeches. When he died in 1820, he had outlived his wife, most of his children, and his sanity. A gentle man, undone by his own mind. But if George III was tragic, George IV was theatrical. Imagine everything his father wasn't: vain, extravagant, and allergic to moderation. He was obsessed with fashion, food, and flattery. A man who loved being admired more than being competent. He spent his youth drinking, gambling, and chasing actresses, particularly Maria Fitzherbert, a Roman Catholic widow he married illegally. The marriage was declared void, but he still sent her passionate letters about how misunderstood he was. He wrote poetry, too. Terrible poetry. When his father fell ill, George became Prince Regent. Hence the Regency era, the age of empire waistlines, drawing rooms, and scandalous affairs. He built Brighton Pavilion, a seaside palace shaped like an opium dream, domes, minarets, and chandeliers that looked like exploding jellyfish. It was glorious, and hideous, and very him. As king, he was lazy, overweight, and self-pitying. He insisted on being addressed as Your Sacred Majesty, even by his dogs. When he finally died, bloated and miserable, his people reportedly celebrated. The newspapers called him a sovereign of great promise and small performance. Which, to be honest, is generous. And then came William IV, the Sailor King. He'd spent his youth in the Navy, swearing like a sailor, living with an actress, and fathering at least 10 illegitimate children. By the time he became king, he was 64, cranky but refreshingly human. He once dismissed Parliament because they stayed too long past dinner. He hated pomp and refused coronation rehearsals. And he detested the new invention of photography, called it vulgar. Still, he had one great virtue: he adored his niece, Victoria. And when he died in 1837, the throne passed to her. The world shifted again. The Georgians, with all their powdered absurdities, faded into memory. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the echo of harpsichords and the rustle of silk. Imagine the kings pacing through their gilded corridors, proud, confused, and a little lost. They weren't villains, not really. Just men born into crowns far too heavy for their heads. And beneath all the ceremony, they were still, like everyone, afraid of being forgotten. Sleep well. And if your dreams take you to a Georgian ballroom, remember, smile politely, dance slowly, and never mention America. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting into one of history's most haunting stories, not because it's dramatic, though it is, but because it feels like watching a candle burn down, inch by inch, and never being able to stop it. The Romanovs ruled Russia for more than 300 years. They built an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. And then, in one short, frozen century, they lost everything, not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet room, deep in the Ural Mountains. But let's not rush there yet. We'll move slowly, as always. Let's begin with Nicholas II, the last Tsar, a man born to rule millions, who would have been much happier managing a small garden. Nicholas was crowned in 1896. He was gentle, polite, and deeply religious, the kind of man who apologized to servants. But he had no instinct for power. He didn't crave it, didn't even like it. Unfortunately, being Emperor of Russia wasn't a job you could politely decline. He married Alexandria Fyodorovna, a German princess, Queen Victoria's granddaughter, in fact. She was devoted to him, utterly, and believed he'd been chosen by God. Which is beautiful, in theory. In practice, it meant she saw every political problem as a test of divine will. A dangerous outlook when you're ruling an empire the size of a planet. Together they had 5 children, 4 daughters and, finally, a son, Alexei, the long-awaited heir. He was sweet, pale, and doomed from birth. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a genetic bleeding disorder that came down the family line from Queen Victoria. A gift, if one can call it that, of royal inbreeding. A cut, a bruise, even a fall could leave him near death. And his mother, Alexandra, never recovered from the fear of losing him. Enter Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin, peasant, mystic, alleged holy man, and professional enigma. He wandered into their lives around 1905, smelling faintly of incense and unwashed miracles. He claimed he could ease Alexei's pain through prayer. And, disturbingly, it seemed to work. Whenever Rasputin was near, Alexei's bleeding lessened. Maybe it was hypnosis. Maybe coincidence. Or maybe Rasputin just had impeccable timing. Either way, Alexandria saw him as a messenger from God. Nicholas tolerated him because he adored his wife. In the court, well, the court seethed. Because Rasputin was not subtle. He drank, boasted, and entertained admirers with unsettling enthusiasm. Rumors spread like frost. The mad monk who whispered to the Tsarina. The peasant who ruled the palace. It wasn't true, not completely, but it didn't matter. Perception is poison in politics, and the empire was already sick. Meanwhile, Russia itself was cracking. Industrial unrest. Peasant revolts. A disastrous war with Japan that no one saw coming and everyone regretted. And then came 1905, the year of revolution. Protesters marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace, holding icons and portraits of the Tsar. They wanted reforms, not rebellion. But the guards panicked. Shots were fired. Bodies fell in the snow. Bloody Sunday, they called it. And after that, Nicholas II, once the little father of Russia, became something else. The man who turned his army on his own people. He signed concessions, promised a constitution, and created a Duma, a kind of parliament. Then he spent the next decade quietly ignoring it. Because, deep down, he couldn't imagine ruling any other way than autocratically. He wasn't cruel. He was immovable. Which, in politics, is just another form of cruelty. Then came World War I. And Russia was not ready. Millions were sent to the front with little food, poor weapons, and even poorer leadership. Nicholas decided to take personal command of the army. Which sounds noble until you realize it left the government in the hands of Alexandria and, indirectly, Rasputin. The results were catastrophic. Defeats piled up. Cities starved. Faith in the monarchy crumbled. By 1916, even the nobility had had enough. A group of conspirators invited Rasputin to dinner, poisoned his wine, shot him, beat him, and finally drowned him in the Neva River. It was a murder so overcomplicated it almost feels like performance art. When they found his body, his hand was frozen in a gesture of blessing. Poetic, in a grim sort of way. The following year, 1917, everything fell apart. Bread riots in Petrograd turned into revolution. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Nicholas abdicated quietly, almost politely, like a man canceling an appointment. He believed it was temporary. That order would return. It didn't. Alexandria, and their 5 children were placed under house arrest, first in luxury, then in isolation. They wrote letters, played piano, took family photos in the garden. It all looked strangely normal. But the world outside had already moved on. As the Civil War raged, the Bolsheviks decided the Romanovs were too dangerous to leave alive. On a dark July night in 1918, in a basement in Ekaterinburg, Nicholas, Alexandria, their children, and loyal servants were told they were being photographed for safety. Instead, gunfire. Chaos. A short, brutal silence. And just like that, 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended, not with a coronation, but an execution. For decades, no one spoke openly of it. The Soviet government erased them from textbooks, their graves hidden, their story left to rumor. But memory is stubborn. Whispers persisted, of survival, of imposters, of ghosts. In the 1920s, a woman in Berlin claimed to be Anastasia, the youngest daughter. She fooled some, inspired movies, and gave hope to a country that had forgotten how to grieve. But when her DNA was tested decades later, she wasn't. She was just another lost soul trying to fill a royal silence. The real remains of the family were discovered in 1991, buried in a forest. Identified by forensic DNA. Reinterred with ceremony. The church canonized them as martyrs, passion bearers. A final, peaceful title for a family who never found peace in life. And now, a century later, their faces still appear, in paintings, in prayers, in candlelight. Nicholas, the gentleman who never wanted a throne. Alexandra, the mother who mistook faith for fate. And 5 children, smiling, educated, tender, who never saw another dawn. Their story lingers not because it's violent, but because it's heartbreakingly ordinary in its inevitability. A family trapped by history, by duty, by the machinery of power. They could have been happy. They might have lived quietly, somewhere in the countryside, feeding ducks and pretending the empire was someone else's problem. But history doesn't do quietly. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, picture the winter palace under snow. The windows dark. The halls silent. And somewhere, faintly, the echo of laughter, the ghosts of children running down marble corridors. They ruled an empire of ice and gold. And in the end, left behind only silence. Sleep well. And if you dream of them, let it be in summer. In a bright St. Petersburg garden, where the lilacs bloom and no one is afraid.